Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. Thank you to all our panelists for taking out the time to do this session, especially on a hectic Monday afternoon. I really, really appreciate all of you taking out the time. I am Sanjana. I work as an associate of Belong Research Collective, and I welcome you all to the 9th day of the inaugural edition of the xSDG UnConference, which is an initiative of Belong. A little bit about Belong for more context. Belong is a social innovation platform that seeks to offer discrimination-free services to people who are otherwise discriminated against on the basis of their identities. It could be on the basis of caste, gender, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, so on and so forth. We run programs for about 3 major verticals, and these are called the Research Collective, which is what the UnConference is a part of. We have the Mental Health Collective, and then the Literature Collective that's more focused on arts and culture and diversity and inclusion. So the UnConference is a part of one of our major initiatives that Belong, called the xSDG, which is a global platform to promote truly intersectional and inclusive international development. At xSDG, although we are at a very nascent stage, we have been trying to curate a lot of resources in terms of research papers, reports, data sets that focus on development through the lens of intersectional identities. The UnConference, now onto the UnConference, is in collaboration with organizations such as Dalberg, JPAL South Asia, and Breakthrough India. It started on the 18th and will run up to the 31st of August. We have had about 10 to 12 panels already, and we have about 20 sessions in total. And these are focused on understanding how SDG programming and funding can better address the needs of people who are otherwise marginalized on the basis of their identities. We've been featuring a lot of, and we will continue to feature a lot of interactive sessions with thinkers, with academics like you, with doers, funders, and development experts who are focused on SDG topics and more through the lens of intersectional identities. So that's it from me in terms of the conference. I will now hand it over to Kanishka. A little bit about Kanishka, who is going to be moderating the session today. He's an associate partner with Dalberg and is based in Bombay. He has deep experience in energy access and renewable energy, inclusive business models, agriculture, and nutrition. His recent work in the energy sector includes working with development organizations to evaluate the potential impact of new energy solutions and sources and helping develop the 5-year energy strategy for US aid in Southeast Asia. That's it from me. Over to you, Kanishka, and thank you so much for curating and moderating this session.
Great. Thank you very much, Sanjana. And thank you also to the organizers of xSDG 2021. Welcome one and all to the panel on making energy access programs truly inclusive. Thank you very much for joining us today. Access to clean and affordable energy, both electricity and clean cooking, is a key driver of human development and growth globally. Within and across countries, there is a strong and consistent correlation between Human Development Index scores and levels of energy access. In India, for example, that correlation stands at close to 98%. There have been significant improvements, which is the good news, in terms of energy access over the past 2 decades, with literally billions in East Asia and South Asia in particular gaining access. However, these gains have not been equally shared, and groups within certain identities have been, to put it fairly bluntly, systematically excluded. Research, some of it coming from several of our panelists today, shows that, for example, lower caste and tribal households have about 10 to 30% less access to electricity and clean cooking fuels. Cooking gas, especially in terms of LPG, is available to just 17% of Dalit households and about 9% of Adivasi households, compared to much higher proportion for the overall population. And women typically spend more time collecting fuels and are more exposed to negative health implications of poor quality fuels, such as through indoor pollution. And these trends are, applicable in many developing countries beyond just the stats and figures that were quoted for India. So panel discussion today will really focus on these segments, not just in India, and really aim to unpack the complex basket of issues that contribute to the status quo. Most importantly, we want to try and use the time today to identify and showcase solutions and best practices that can practically contribute to equitable energy access. And I want to note that this discussion is even more timely when placed within within the context and in light of global commitments to 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 7, which relates to universal access to clean electricity and cooking, as well as 2050 net zero commitments, which are currently top of mind in the lead up to COP26 in Scotland later this year. So to help us get there, we have an exemplary set of panelists gathered on this call. Let me quickly run through some introductions. We have Dr. Namrata Chindarkar. Professor Chindarkar is an associate professor and chairperson at the JSW School of Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. She's a fellow of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Her research addresses questions pertaining to sustainable development and social policy. We also have Dr. Vibhor Saxena, who is a lecturer at the School of Finance and Economics at the University of St. Andrews. Dr. Saxena's field of specialization is development economics. His research interests are mainly based on the issues of energy, inequality, health, and microfinance. We have Sasmita Patnaik on the line. She is the gender advisor for the Water and Energy for Food South and Southeast Asia Regional Hub. The program, which is supported by a variety of international donors, aims to scale innovations in the water, energy, food nexus through grant, technical assistance, and investment facilitation. Most of Sasmita's current and past work is focused on the integration of gender and social equity lenses in policy research and entrepreneurship in the energy access sector. And finally, we have Rodrigo Paris, who is the international CEO of Barefoot College. Barefoot College, as many of us already know, operates in over 2,000 villages in close to 100 countries worldwide to impact more than 2 million people with access to clean water, livelihoods, and safe renewable energy. He was previously Barefoot College Director for Latin America. And since 1999, he's lived in 6 different countries in Europe, Asia, and America. And his line of work has always been focused on the defense of human rights and minorities, particularly within the context of the benefits and challenges generated by media and new technologies. So, and as Sanjana said, for the next 80 minutes or so, I'm your host. I'm Kanishka, and I'm an associate partner at Dalberg's Bombay office. I lead a lot of our energy practice work. So one final point before we get started, we really want this to be an interactive and lively session. To that effect, while I'm here to guide the conversation, panelists, please feel free to use the raise hands function on Zoom whenever you have a point that you want to make, and it'll help me keep my interventions to a minimum. And audience members, we request you to note your questions as we go along. We have reserved at least 30 minutes for Q&A at the end, and we really want to hear from you. So with that, let me dive quickly into things. And I suppose on a topic like this, it's really important to start by unpacking what we mean by terms like access and trying to get to some baseline understanding of the nature and the extent of these identity-linked exclusions. So to get us going, my first question is going to be to Dr. Chindarkar. Doctor, you recently co-authored a paper on energy access for marginalized communities in North India, especially in the backdrop of large public sector initiatives on electricity and LPG cooking. What can you tell us about the view from the ground? Which communities are being excluded and are most at risk, especially in India?
Thank you, Kanishka. And I think that's a great question because that allows me to start on a bit of a positive note here. So what we do in that paper is we use what's the access survey, and that looks at 6 energy access deprived states in India. And it's over 2 time periods. So it's a panel data set, exactly the same households, 2014 versus 2018. And then we compare so we look at the differences by the different communities, so SC, ST, and all of the others. And why I say a positive note is because in between those 2 years, a lot of reforms happened, both across the energy sectors, electricity as well as energy access. And what we find is that there is, in terms of access, and that is grid electricity, LPG, and also across various dimensions of these 2. So as you were saying, how do we define access? So we look at the multi-tier framework, of course. And we find that there is a positive increase even for the SC/ST community, although at a slower speed. So there is increasing inclusiveness, although it could be done better, is the message that we are trying to relay through that research. So the way the policies are formulated and will be formulated going forward, I think is going to be extremely important in making sure that the gaps, so although the effects are positive, whatever are the remaining gaps, they are also overcome in the near to medium term. So that is how I would summarize the finding and say that it's a step in the right direction when it comes to inclusiveness, mainly coming from public policy reforms.
Vibhor, you've also done a fair bit of work on, several of the similar issues, particularly, I think, diving deep into caste and class and also religion. How does what Namrata is saying, how does that resonate with the work that you've been doing?
So it's a bit similar, but I mean, a little bit different as well. So I did find similar results. I'm not sure whether Namrata used primary data. I use secondary data, standard NSSO data, and I was estimating returns to several variables. It was, of course, not panel data, so there were some issues. And with the limited data sources, I tried to estimate that what is the difference between the returns to income or returns to education or returns to documentation for different communities. So what I found by using standard techniques of econometrics that there was statistically significant difference between SC/ST communities and the upper caste Hindu household or general Hindu households in the context of returns to income or returns to education or returns to any other variable which we think that can determine access to clean electricity or cooking fuel sources. What I also realized that in many cases there is a standing discrimination against Muslims. Now, the problem is that it is very difficult to devise that because a lot of Muslims live in urban areas, but there is a standard practice of ghettoization over there. And this is my assumption, this is one of the assumptions I made in the paper, that there is a possibility that due to the existing ghettoization, there is some kind of discrimination which exists in the background, that the supply of electricity or clean cooking fuel, it becomes easier for some part of the community which are in the supply line to discriminate against the Muslim households. But it becomes really difficult to prove until unless first-hand data is collected. But I tried to use the second-hand data, no panel data, and my results were quite solid in the sense that yes, there is some kind of subtle discrimination which exists against Muslim communities as well. So this hasn't been done in the past. And of course, what Namrata is suggesting that there is a progress, but the progress is slow. Once again, if we do it with the more recent data, my question is that, and I would like to conduct further research on this, that is this change coming after all the non-marginalized households or social groups have completely been satisfied with the access to electricity? After that, are we providing access to these resources to the marginalized groups, or is it some kind of equal form of distribution is happening overall, or it's just a clear pace of slow growth?
Yeah, makes sense. Sasmita, you have obviously focused a lot of your work on gender, but also looked at caste and class as well. And I think in particular, again, research paper which was focused on the LPG distribution program in India. But I think even extrapolating more broadly from that and maybe coming in a little bit specifically on the issue of gender and gender-driven exclusivities as you think about access to energy, what can you tell us in terms of what's the range of difference for women in terms of energy access, and is it the same across, let's say, cooking and electricity?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Very happy to be here, and thank you everyone for joining the panel today. So let me take a step back and kind of say why this is an issue to begin with. So our social structures, if you think of it, have systemically been inequitable, right? Like you have different share of access to land, different share of access to other economic tangibles and intangibles. So whenever you're designing a policy or an infrastructure on such a unequal base, and you are not making a direct intervention, then it's likely to like adopt the same inequalities, right? Therefore, policies which come and target specific marginalized sections are likely to provide you better gains, because then you are taking their context into account. And in this sense, if you look at gender-based inequities, and gender is like obviously a spectrum, but here for our conversation, I'd focus on men and women. You'd see a lot of these infrastructural development or access to market, access to capital, finance, resources has been skewed towards men. And again, within that, there are intersections where certain castes get better access to certain tangibles versus other castes. Certain communities get better access to certain tangibles than others. And within that, of course, there are women where they don't have access to land, they don't have access to economic power to make decisions, their cultural barriers, and therefore any policy which doesn't take that into account is likely to just give you numbers at the household level, but just stop there. We don't go into the household and understand the intra-household dynamic, that there's a power structure there as well. And somebody is making a decision and somebody is choosing what needs to be spent on, what needs of the household are important, and what kind of role do women play in that. So based on the data that Namrata was talking about, the Access Survey, we also see a strong correlation between LPG use and households where women are able to make a decision on when should cylinders be ordered, or how, or if deciding whether they should order a refill or not. And similarly, you see in many of these states, the decision of when to get a refill is still with men. It's not something that women decide. There is a lot of time and energy that's spent in that convincing the head of the household in many cases, right, which is men. So I feel a lot of energy policies just stop there. And when you think about electricity, again, that's completely assumed as a household issue. We don't think of electricity as a gendered issue, but it is. Like, men and women use energy for different things within a household. So for example, if I kind of tell you about Saubhagya, you are giving households an option to have 2 light points in the house. Now, nobody is giving them a choice of where these light points need to go. So who's making the decision of whether the kitchen is going to be lit, or whether the cattle shed is going to be lit, or whether the porch is going to be lit? Who's making those decisions? And if women are not consciously being involved in those decisions, you're likely to have a very skewed outcome. Your numbers would appear as though you have achieved the targets, but within the household, if you delve deeper, you would see these disparities. So I think there are a lot of these nuances which definitely a lot of these policies or programs need to look at. And I think a similar emerging disparity is what we are seeing when we talk about energy access and livelihoods, where a lot of mechanization is skewed towards activities that are predominantly male dominated, whether in the agriculture or the non-agriculture space.
Yeah, no, I think your statement, I think, provided us a lot of, I think, points to pick up on, and I think particularly important for us to dig deeper as we go along in terms of some of the structural inequalities that you were talking about. And also, I think this, framing of electricity or even energy access writ large in terms of just a simple on-off switch, right? Without unpacking in terms of who is actually getting that access at the household level once you dig deeper. One question before one quick point of clarification from you, Sasmita, before I have pose a question to Rodrigo is, as you think about gender and some of the other exclusions that we've touched upon, would you say that, gender across even these other intersections of caste and class sits sort of subordinate even within those different segments? So for example, would you find that within lower castes, women are even more excluded, or is that a statement that is not necessarily generalizable?
I think how I would rephrase it is the challenges for women in upper caste versus lower caste or tribal households are different. But women compared to men within each caste category would be marginalized. So the access, the kind of decision-making power that women would have, it's not necessarily true that women in upper caste, from upper caste families have larger decision-making power than lower caste families. That's not true. Tribal families have sometimes more equitable structures. But the kind of challenges that women in tribal households will face will be different, which will be limiting for them. Compared to women in upper caste families. Similarly, these intersections will come in forms of not just caste, but also urban-rural. We did a study in urban slums of India last year, and we realized that only 50% of households are using LPG exclusively. So whole of urban India, if you look at the numbers, the access rates are much higher for cooking energy, but when you focus on urban slums, again, this rural-urban divide is kind of very significant. And within that, we see the decision-making ability of women are also different when you look at it by class, social class within the urban households, right? So I think it would be fair to say that women are marginalized across all these categories, and it's cross-cutting because it's also a major share of the population. You're talking about half of the world's population, right? Almost. So it would be, that lens would come in through an intersection when you focus on any social group. It's just that we need to understand how that operates, how does the gender dynamics operate within each of these class and class structures.
Right. No, thank you. Rodrigo, let me bring you in. Our discussion thus far is kind of naturally focused, I think, based on the interests of our panelists on India, but I think would love to hear from you, especially, bringing in a little bit of that global perspective. You've worked in several regions, I think particularly in Latin American countries as well. How does this, how do these exclusions play out in contexts outside of India? And I think particularly if there are things that you've heard that are common versus things that are actually quite different.
Kanishka, many thanks. I'm very happy. It's an honor to be here with you and the extraordinary fellows panelists that I'm delighted to share these ideas with all of you and the public that is following us. So yeah, it's pretty interesting to hear in detail your positions and ideas from and in relation with India. And Barefoot College International is born in India and has his roots in a tiny village in Rajasthan. But our evolution in the last 10 years give us a lot of lessons in terms of understand more and more, as you mentioned, the connection between the things happening in India and the solutions and our approach in India and the situation and challenges in 93 countries where we have projects and presence. We believe 100% that the rural world has a lot of in common, and most of the problems and solutions are pretty well connected. But for different reasons, our geography, politics, and multilateralism is not well connected in that way. So we are missing the option to interchange better practices and ideas and to understand the world in terms of solutions with more empathy. In the experience that we have in Latin America, for example, that I'm from Latin America, I used to live in Latin America and do projects for Barefoot College in Latin America for about 8 years, is absolutely a huge gap to understand or to see why India or why Barefoot College from India is doing work and programs in terms of gender and access to energy in Latin American communities. Either way, for the Indian government, or for that is our partner, or for the India spectrum of Barefoot College, is pretty difficult to improve and to do better work in Latin America, because it's so far, because it's not part of the real interest for India. But I was there, I was in Latin America, and I was trying to create this tiny bridge to connect Barefoot College with Latin America and India with Latin America. In terms of the government, in terms of the good solutions that we are doing in India, and how those solutions could be part of the Latin American spectrum. So this is a big issue. The second one, and after 8 years, we did a few steps, but so far from the ideal that have a very well connected interchange of outcomes in Latin America, India, either, and move on with a more practical and pragmatic solutions, and advance, understand better and better the things happening on the field. The other point that I really highlight from our experience in Latin America that have some connection with India is the racism that we suffer in the region. We have a region that is about 500 million people in Latin America across 20 countries. 10% of those population is 50 million are indigenous. And indigenous people are located in rural areas where normally, they don't have access to electricity, to energy, and to proper services. And it's because the elites and the status quo of the government in the capitals of each country is a phenomenon that cross all Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, big countries, small countries, the Caribbean, etc. Is not a real interest from the politicians and the public policy to include minorities in the agenda. It's a nice words and really good propaganda, but that at the end, the public policies is not in connection with the realities and the things that happen in isolated villages where beautiful people speaking more or less 500 languages in Latin America are living or surviving, if we could say that more accurate. So I think that this is one of the critical things, the racism that is part of the status quo of the elites, the governments, and the private sector. And the last point that I want to mention is the idea that poor institutions in the rural areas. So normally our governments, and I see this in India as well, and in Latin America, Africa, put a lot of emphasis in urban areas in or some rural areas that are at least some connection with the development world. But for the isolated communities, the lack of institutions is absolutely critical. So either for governments, private sector, of social NGOs, organizations like Barefoot College International, it's pretty difficult to keep the track and move with other stages with our projects, because we don't have institutions, local institutions, to get a really strong partnerships to see how things advance for the future. So we do impact, we create solutions, the women receive training about solar and put the solar systems, and they are doing an amazing job. But to move on is pretty difficult because the lack of institutions in the areas. So that's one of the things that Barefoot College International is doing now. We are trying to decentralize our approach, our operations, not only in India, but internationally, to create a Barefoot College International centers. So one center in Zanzibar, one center in Senegal, one center in Guatemala, one center in Fiji. And we as an institution located in a rural isolated area, we are going to be and love to be the platform to connect with government, with private companies, with multilateral, and with the communities at all, to understand much better our programs, our projects, the outcomes, and how they are connected with India and internationally.
Great. Thank you, Rodrigo. I think, you know, the points around the inequalities, especially for indigenous people in Latin America, really resonate. And I think there's a lot to sort of pick up on, because there are definitely parallels in India as well as in Asia. I would like, you know, just kind of get into a bit of a discussion at a deeper level in terms of what's actually driving these inequalities, right? And I think, Sasmita, you've already started laying some of those factors down. There are some structural factors. There are some factors which are, you know, much more focused and relevant to each segment. Rodrigo, you started also talking a little bit about the lack of institutional capacity as well. So open question to anyone in the panel to, you know, start us just unpacking that a little bit. What's driving, what are the underlying drivers of some of these inequalities existing and continuing to persist over time? Namrata, I saw your hand first, so I'll go to you.
Thank you, Kanishka. I actually just wanted to pick up on some of the things which the other panelists already said, just to add a little more data points. So to Vibhor's findings, and we find something very similar, which is when you start unpacking. So as I mentioned, overall, if we compare, say, the SC/ST group as a whole with the rest of the population, there are improvements. However, if you start unpacking the data, what we find is a lot of the improvements are driven by the access among the SC communities. And the ST communities continue to be marginalized relative to everybody else, even relative to the SC communities. And why I say this gets to what Vibhor was saying is because at least our argument is there's probably more location-based bias. So all of this boils down to what Vibhor was saying, that it's a supply chain issue. Whether or not this is conscious discrimination is something that we need to discuss further. But what we definitely find is that there is a location-based bias, and therefore from a supply side of policy design, I think they need to think of how they are essentially entrenching some of these inequalities, although that may not be the intention, just that the last mile delivery is still not very effective. So we find this particularly in the case of, say, LPG delivery. So that on that particular indicator, the ST community is still do much worse compared to any other community. Interestingly, to respond to what Sasmita was saying, slightly different findings. And Sasmita, you know, so the data set that both of us we were referring to is the Access to Clean Cooking Energy Survey of States, where her previous organization was, and myself, we were involved in that data. So what we find is when we look at willingness to pay for exclusive use of LPG, and I'm emphasizing the word exclusive here, because there are lots of households that use it as a, say, complementary fuel. There are no gender differences. I mean, we find that gender has no significant correlation when it comes to willingness to pay for exclusive use. And this is what we control for, is essentially whether women are among the decision makers. So either they are the main decision makers or they are the joint decision makers. And that's the question that we pick up. And we actually find that it's uncorrelated with the exclusive use of LPG. And Sasmita, you can throw more light on why you think that might be. Of course, it goes back to essentially very few households still using exclusively. So it might be just a sample size, purely a sample size issue. Or there could be deeper gender dimensions here, which our data, of course, we could not dig deeper into that. And agreed on the institutional aspects that Rodrigo mentioned. I think those are very important. And I think that is where a lot of the policy reform that is happening in India, and why I would say again, on a slightly positive note here, is that some of the things which have been put in place are trying to circumvent some of those institutional gaps. For instance, the way the Ujjwala supplies LPG through direct transfers. So to do away with any kind of cash transactions, which may cause all kinds of leakages and delays and so on, making ordering more efficient, also giving people the choice of the gas agency that they want to get their supply from, and so on. So there is a conscious attempt, at least in the policy reforms more recently, to overcome some of these institutional gaps or whatever you say in terms of improving the transparency and reducing the leakages in the system. So while I agree, what I also see is that there is, at least in the design of the policy itself, there is an explicit emphasis on as much as possible getting circumventing those barriers. So just my perspective.
Thanks, Namrata. Sasmita, maybe you want to come in on some of the findings that Namrata talked about on the gender side. But I think one question to just follow up and would be good to get perspectives on as well is, especially reflecting on some of the positives that you mentioned, Namrata. I imagine some of these things that we're talking about in terms of targeting specific segments, incorporating various lenses into planning, particularly on the regulation side of things. I imagine some of this is quite well known to planners and policy actors. So as you think about some of these challenges, it'd be good to hear your perspectives also on, at a deeper level, if these are known, then what's stopping them from being implemented more universally. But over to you, Sasmita.
No, I completely agree with Namrata. The data could have shown that there's like no gender difference in the willingness to pay when it comes to exclusive use of LPG, because another data set that was also kind of co-published by CW, there we saw when we were interviewing men and women in the same households, the interest to use LPG or the preference they wanted to give to LPG was similar. So yes, when you ask people if they are willing to pay for it and if they want to use it, you wouldn't see a gender difference. However, when it comes to transitioning into the practicality of use, there could be a difference because every household is then competing with a lot of priority needs, such as healthcare, such as education, and there's like a basket of expenses within which LPG becomes one. Also, I think intersectionalities are important to consider here. Like there could be households from a certain class, from a certain caste, from a certain geography, which could be behaving very differently. So tribal households in West Bengal are much better off than tribal households in a state like Chhattisgarh. Because the overall infrastructure of West Bengal might be better, the agency of women within those households might be better. So I think unless our policies start using this dual approach of what I say, both integrated as well as targeted methods to address a problem, we will run into these kind of parallels existing within the same country, right? So for example, like you need to have an energy policy, you need to have a cooking energy policy, but you also need to have a targeted cooking energy policy for the tribals of this country, or for the lower caste of this country, or for understanding how women fit into each of these policies as you design the implementation guidelines. I'm sorry, there's like a little bit of park cut on and off here, so the lights.
No problems. We can still hear you clearly.
Yeah. So there's so unless these policies kind of go down to the implementation guidelines and then see how these specific actors fit into it, it'll be challenging to translate those gains into individual level developmental outcomes at the end of the day. And some of the you pointed out towards some of these systemic structures, why they have continued to operate the way they do. I feel there are 2-3 major factors that we need to think about. One is the process of analysis itself is somehow skewed. Like a lot of these policies don't have a gender analysis or a caste analysis to begin with. Yes, there is an interest and things have changed. The Ujjwala scheme, for instance, targeted marginalized communities, which you will see reflecting in the outcome. You will see like a lot more SC and ST households have received connections compared to like general households. But I think that analysis at the policy design level or a program design level is important. How do you bring in a gender analysis to decide that? Then looking at this disaggregated data and trying to understand, does it make sense from the program outcomes? So a couple of these ideas, I'm just saying that these things don't happen. These are, of course, solutions that should come in. Maybe you will talk about them later, but these are also things that are not happening right now, which is why that systemic bias continues to remain. And when you talk about these expertise or these voices that are also not present in the design space, right? Like when you're designing a program or a policy, do you have people who come with that kind of expertise? Are you talking to women's organizations to understand what are the kind of barriers that need to be addressed in that implementation design also? So these things don't happen, which is why that it perpetuates. And some of these programs might want to address that by doing exactly this. And creating budget for it is also a barrier, because you might say you want to address a certain community and address barriers of a certain community, but if you're not putting additional resources to address that, then how are you going to address it? Because there's an additional cost to it. Like if you're not incentivizing distributors to serve remote areas that Namrata was talking about, or to serve certain caste communities which may be difficult to make business sense with, right? Like you're only getting 3 orders a day versus from general households, you might be getting 10 orders a day. So you prefer delivering to them over the ones who are giving you less economically viable businesses. Your policies also need to incentivize this. If you don't do these things, then the market is only responding to the policy incentive or the behavior that is being expected. So I think some of these systemic biases therefore have perpetuated, because at the analysis level and the implementation level, this targeted and integrated lens don't come together. So there's either an integrated lens or a targeted lens, but it needs to come together, and these intersectionalities needs to be like brought together.
Right. No, I think super important point. Vibhor, Rodrigo, do you sort of also see that, you know, these exclusions are sort of largely a result of some large supply side challenges?
Yeah, I mean, can I go ahead if that's okay?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so there are 2 or 3 points. First of all, Tanish, you and Sasmita were discussing about gender roles and caste. So I would like to pitch in on that, and I would like to suggest that I did some work on this. It is unpublished, and one of the chapters has been published lately on BRICS. And while studying that, and I did study about gender roles and caste in the context of SC, ST, Muslim, and I realized that there is no significant differences amongst the gender roles. There could be state level differences, because of course, Eastern India is more matriarchal in comparison to the cow belt states or in comparison to Southern India, you know. So those things do exist, those differences do exist. But within the given space of, for example, let's take an example of states like Haryana, Punjab, and Rajasthan. If you find SC, ST households or the general caste households, you don't find differences in gender roles. In fact, there will be more negative externalities in the upper caste households against women in comparison to the SC, ST households. So that is something which Namrata and Sasmita was suggesting, and I would totally agree with this. There is one more thing which Namrata suggested about ST households. That's the same thing happened with my data when I was analyzing that ST households seem to suffer most, you know. And I mean, could that be the political representation? This is something which can be looked into. Do they have sufficient political representation? I don't know, right? But that could be something which can be looked into, looking at the differences that where they have more political representation, their condition or access to electricity is significantly better in comparison to other regions, okay? And other than that, there are 2 issues which I haven't come across sufficient in the literature, is geographical issues and natural calamities. These are something which are exogenous factors completely determining all other outcomes as well, whether it is education, nutrition, consumption levels? Could they be determining access to clean cooking fuels or electricity as well? Because, for example, somebody raised the point that, I think it was Sasmita who raised this, that in Chhattisgarh, ST households are generally, can be worse off in comparison to, West Bengal. So is it because that the geography allows, or the natural calamities do not happen as much as in West Bengal, as much as happens in Chhattisgarh, or Chhattisgarh is simply a landlocked state, and historically there was, no economic development or development of institutions, and that leads to the current lack of access to clean energy, amongst other goods as well. So that is what one point. There is last point, and this is a question as well. If somebody can answer this, it's related to gender. I have read many studies where literature is talking about bargaining power and electricity, one way or the other, with simultaneity. But there is I haven't come across any single study which is sufficiently addressing or explaining the mechanism that access to electricity somehow increases the bargaining power of a female in the household. Every study just simply, plug in some data, run some regressions, and present some results. But there is no study which clearly explains the mechanism, which suggests that why access to electricity or why access to clean cooking fuels can increase the bargaining power, or vice versa, right? And one quick question to Rodrigo, if Rodrigo can answer this, please. There is in 1920s and 30s, there was this rise of import substitution industrialization in Latin America, which created massive issues in Latin America, development of CPAL, and cut off from the core, which led to the lack of access to the technology as well. Do you think that, and I mean, the dark shadow of those days from 1920s till 1950s still lingers on Latin America? Do you think Latin America overall, one of the most successful region in the early previous century, just because of those policies, lacked some sort of access to technology, and created differences with core, and fell in the category of other developing countries in the context of electricity access?
Rodrigo, yeah, please feel free to come in. And I think
2 or 3, sorry. Yeah.
I think Vibhor has asked an important question there, just in terms of the economic history of the region, but would also love to hear your perspectives on whether you share some of these reflections that in many ways this is primarily a problem and failure of policy and leadership at the at the very top, and therefore in many ways a lot of the solutions need to kind of lie in that front first and foremost.
Thank you very much. Just to reply the Vibhor question about the Latin American implication, the history in terms of the access to energy. Yeah, the continent did a really good work at the beginning of the previous century, and we were in a really good momentum before the Second World War. But then after the communism arrived as the main topic of the agenda, and this polarization between capitalism and communism destroyed many of the initiatives and the advances that the region had. So the tipping point for the agenda during the 60s and 70s was super hard in terms of the lose the momentum that we had. Why? Because after this critical black and white communism and capitalism and the huge influence of the United States in the region, a lot of dictatorships and authoritarianism regimes start to do things in Latin America for good and for bad. So understand from different ideologies, but this kind of alliance with the progress and the infrastructure was forgotten in many ways. Then in the 90s, after democracy in some way consolidate governments in the region, we did a really good work in terms of the infrastructure and the access to energy, but not for the isolated areas. So we did some progress, much better than Africa and some countries in Southeast Asia for sure. But this creates that only the minorities in Latin America are with the problem of access to energy. So now who is going to take care of those minorities? If the cooperation and solutions and ideas are focused in Africa and Southeast Asia, India, etc. So in some way, the historical process in Latin America put the minorities again in the last part of the queue to receive solutions. Now I just want to go back to the Sasmita position and ideas about the implementation that is absolutely important. And I really understand and support your approach. And I believe that we are agree, all of us, that SDGs are the right way to do things, and we need to move on the agenda by 2030. But I see, and we see in Barefoot College in India, Africa, Latin America, that is, we have the full agreement on SDGs, but the difficulty is how to implement the idea. And we consider that governments, civil society, and private sector have different interests, have different time to organize and put things on the field for the people, for the minorities, for the women, for rural communities, and then the knowledge, how to do it. Some approaches from governments are completely different from the civil society and NGOs, and some approaches and ideas from the private sector are completely disconnected from the communities. So I think that is a matter that we have different times, different knowledges, and different interests to try to get one common solution. And this kind of chaotic interruption of common practices is one of the big walls that we need to overpass with a little bit more humble spirit to understand which is the best for this community and maybe for this country, but not is the best for this government in this other region or for this company in this specific community. So not easy to find, and I think that humans try to find the right solution, the only common solution, the popular solution to copy paste, and it's absolutely impossible in terms of poverty, gender, and SDGs to find the only one solution. But then it's super difficult to create a consensus about your interest and my time and the resources and the knowledge and the needs of the community. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we have in the next 10 years is how to create this kind of consensus to do the best for each case, and in some way good examples could be applied for some other regions, but I think not for the whole problem that we are facing now globally.
Right. I think wanted to kind of, I think, shift gears a little bit and just, again, think a little bit about what are those solutions that we're actually seeing, exemplars of things that have worked. And I want to go back to, I think, Sasmita, you mentioned this whole balancing act that we have to play between centralized programs that focus on the universal aspects of electricity and energy access versus very targeted initiatives that, focus on those last mile segments and those particularly underserved segments. And I think it's obviously we all realize that this is extremely complex. It's also very hard to get right. And it's very hard to scale, especially once you start looking outside specific countries, right? Because these issues are so deeply woven into the context of that country. So with that in mind, what's worked and what are some sort of best practices that we can think about, right? Particularly from a planning perspective, from a perspective of incorporating these different lenses and voices into the planning perspective. Open to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I can go first if
Please.
If you want. Yeah. So I think thanks for the question. I would say a couple of things that at least I've seen work, one from the government point of view and one from the private sector point of view, which is easily replicable, which is like a decent tool for all of us to adopt, one is gender budgeting. Okay, so you have a policy tool which allows you to kind of budget specific resources. I'm speaking for gender, but of course this is adapted. You can adapt this to other segments of the population as well, where you say, okay, in India, if you see currently only under 5% of our overall budget is accounted for under gender budgeting. And what this tool allows you to do is you track what percent of your government budget is actually going to women, and that for that you need to put in basic systems in place to track the data. But it also gives both central and decentralized policies to an opportunity to go back to that ground level planning and say, okay, if I want to reach a 50% target, or if I want to reach a certain target, how do I work backwards and achieve that target? So if you want to make energy access inclusive, we cannot limit integration of women only to, say, cooking energy policies, which are very stereotypically the woman's job. But it needs to come into other sectors as well. Why doesn't your irrigation policies have a gender lens? Your PM Kusum program, when you're talking about farmer support programs, now, is there a gender lens there? There isn't. Nobody's talking about women farmers, despite majority of women really contributing to farming. So I think gender budgeting gives you that tool to go back and say, okay, that lens needs to be implemented in each policy at the design level itself. And yes, there could be policies where you say it's not relevant, it's not applicable, but it has to come from an informed decision and debate and discussion, and not as a default that you excluded that entire lens of targeting, say, tribal communities or women, or people with disabilities, which is an emerging space that we need to talk about. By default, you cannot do that. It has to be thought through, it has to be discussed, and then use that policy tool to reach there. And once you have budgets for this, you will have people who will come on board to lend their expertise, because you would have created that budget for it, to pay for that kind of expertise. You would have more consultative approaches, like you would speak to the right stakeholders, such as women's groups, such as rights-based organizations, community farmers associations, and then build your policies. And yes, it's not always, it's sometimes easier said than done, but you will get there if you start incorporating these lenses in the beginning, because you don't have to start from scratch every time. You'll get a sense of a lot of these structural changes to begin with when you do that. On the private sector side, something that at least we are trying in this program, and I'm seeing in a lot of donor funded programs happening, is build again this budget for bringing in somebody who has this, who comes in specifically to look at impact on women, who looks at impact on marginalized communities, and build it into entrepreneurship models in a way that it's an incentive for businesses to look at inclusion and not a compulsion. So a lot of businesses now, especially social enterprise space, if you look at it, it's just good business to have an ecosystem ready for you to look at it as potential markets, as potential value chain partners, as potential workers in your supply chain. And if you want to do that as businesses, you have to think differently about inclusion, right? And you don't have to look at it only as a cost element, but also understand the agency and the value inclusion builds into your business value chain. And what these global programs can do is bring in that expertise locally and help businesses boil it down to very specific strategies of how they can implement a gender lens, how they can implement an inclusion lens in their operations. Sometimes it comes down to helping them understand how do you recruit people, what are the kind of groups you need to post your JD in to get responses from the right candidates. It's something as simple as that, something that businesses either don't have the capacity to think about or the resources to invest in. So you can build that kind of expertise and that cost into the programs and have specific team members who can do this for the program and build it with the overall goals of the program. So that at least when you are saying my program is a success, how do you define success? Those parameters of success need to have these inclusion lenses kind of integrated in it. So I think both on the government side and on the private side, there are these two tools that can be used for really kind of working towards an inclusive lens. And this is something a lot of donors, at least in the philanthropic space, have started doing, and then maybe governments also across the world have, like Bangladesh is doing, and Nepal is doing very well on gender budgeting, something that India can learn from. And we wanted to do it, but I think we need to do better.
Right. Namrata, I see your hand's been raised for a while, so I'll go over to you. And I think in particular, just picking up on Sasmita's point around the private sector engagement side, I think that's something that has actually, if you look at certain business models in access to energy, especially when you're thinking about home systems as a parallel in East Africa, the private sector has been a very strong part of that story. Do you think that they can be similarly fine-tuned to look at some other exclusions? Because there, I think it's more broadly a geographical or a income-based exclusion that they're sort of seeking to target. Do you think that can also work for other exclusion categories as well? But maybe over to you, Namrata, and then Rodrigo. I know your hand is raised as well, so we'll go Namrata and then Rodrigo.
Thank you, Kanishka. I also first wanted to respond to a question that Vibhor has raised, which is, I mean, you see these correlations or the inequalities, but what are the underlying mechanisms? I'll comment just based on one study that I was involved in, where we look at the predecessor of what is now a national level, what's called the 24/7 electricity, the Deen Dayal program, and when it was first piloted in the state of Gujarat. So we combined the administrative data from that program with the district level health surveys and the national family health surveys. And we find that there are some significant improvements so in that we're looking specifically at the health inequalities. So there are significant improvements in the facilities, so the PHCs, primary healthcare centers. There are significant improvements in access to health information, which of course is because there is television and mobile phones and so on, as well as there is also an effect which comes from time use. Women are spending less time on labor-intensive activities, so there is better utilization of maternal and child health care services. So the underlying mechanisms are quite interesting, and I think no matter what kind of inequalities you look at, even if you look at education, I think it would be very similar mechanisms. So this was specific to health. There are also papers which look at fertility effects, how electricity actually has a negative effect on, so basically brings down the fertility rate, and that is considered to be empowering. You can question that if you will. And then coming to the question that Kanishka, you were asking, that what has worked? What are those tools which have worked in addressing some of these inequalities? And someone who studies public policies more closely, I would say that there has been some interesting innovations, almost risky, both that have happened in the electricity sector as well as the LPG sector. So coming back to the same policy example that I was giving, which is now the 24/7 National Electrification Program, what it does essentially is that it combines infrastructure with all of the development outcomes, right? So what it is doing is providing a technology solution. Let's segregate the feeders which are going to households and which are going to agriculture. And through that, we will improve the access which is going to households. That it was really complex. So it's a very interesting case study, something which I have written on as well. And you can see that getting translated into better access throughout. I mean, we are not just talking, so there's an improvement across the board. Again, if you start unpacking, you will see that some groups are going slower than the others, and that question is being addressed through other interventions. But that one decision where the technology solution was to just completely segregate the agricultural and household feeders, it was an innovation which was not thought about before, something that even the World Bank has written about, a lot of the other donor organizations have written about, and is being replicated in other countries, including in African countries. Then also on the LPG front, I mean, we just see the Ujjwala scheme the way it is from the user's perspective, the way they get subsidized LPG, but behind that are a lot of complex and risky decisions. Again, the way the negotiations with the oil marketing companies are happening, the way they are being incentivized to absorb some of the risks that are associated with, say, the debt that is being taken on. I mean, these are really, innovative financing mechanisms that have been designed, and it is having that, it is having the trickle down effect. It's a different approach compared to what Sasmita was saying, that you start at the bottom, you target. What I'm talking about is that you start really broad, you innovate at the aggregate level, and then see how the effects are trickling down. I think both needs to happen. And some of these decisions, both on electricity and LPG reforms that have been taken, are really translating into tangible outcomes when it comes to reduced inequalities, at least in the form of the conventional access indicators that you look at. So that would be my response.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I think it's sort of that question, right? Like it's almost like the chicken and egg question, which is, if you look at some of the OECD and developed countries, they kind of focused on what's the best way to have, high quality electricity for everybody, and they really kind of over time focused on that, right? And through that, as you said, probably had some trickle down effects. And I think what we're talking about here is probably reflecting a little bit more on the context within these countries, that you can't just have that for multiple reasons. You also need to, support that through more targeted efforts, including bringing in the private sector, which is, I think, something that I want to explore a little bit further. But Rodrigo, you've had your hand up for a while, so I'll let you come in. And Vibhor, if you have anything to add to this as well, please go ahead after that.
Thank you very much, Kanishka. Yeah, in connection with that point, I need to recognize that the private sector is doing good things in some countries. I want to mention and in connection with other aspects and topics that we have been discussing today about Brazil. Brazil is the India of Latin America in many ways. In terms of economy, in terms of size, in terms of influence. And the energy industry in Brazil is in a really good moment. And the solar is pretty good for us, understanding the relevance for XSDG and to bring more solutions for this vast country, and where the Amazon and the future in terms of natural resources is. But by contradiction, the current government of Brazil is against the protection of the Amazon, is against the environment, and is against the NGO society is doing. It's a huge industry, one country, CDC and G20 that we could see with big eyes is doing. We have in Barefoot College International, we have a project in the Amazon of Brazil. We trained 3 indigenous mothers from the Amazon, Brazilians. They went to India, they received the training program in Barefoot College and they gave the expertise to be solar engineers and to install systems in the middle of the Amazon. When I say the middle of the Amazon, is people that need to take a boat and travel by river about 50 hours to reach a tiny city. But now it's for us, for our organization, it's pretty difficult to implement the program because we have a lot of obstacles from the government to move the equipments and the technology from the Sao Paulo, where we get the equipments, to the tiny village in the middle of the Amazon, because it's a lot of terms of insecurity, customs, national customs, and not easy work for the social civil society people. So this is one red flag that I put here, that how in some way the countries and private sector and some good ideas are moving, but then we have big elephants in the front that is pretty difficult to overpass in the next 1 or 2 years, because not only are the governments with the power and with the with the authority to create a little bit chaos and derail the agenda that we want to implement and we want to help to implement for the good of minorities, people, and in connection obviously with the SDG, that is a clear mandate for the international agenda.
Right. Thank you, Rodrigo. Vibhor, please, would love to hear, I think, a little bit about some of the solutions that you've come across. And I think maybe to ask you, in your discussion to maybe, sharpen the point of inquiry a little bit. Do you think energy subsidies, in particular smart subsidies, have an important role, right? We've talked about the private sector, we've talked about planning, but in many ways, the simplest way to reach unreached populations are energy subsidies. So what's the role there?
Yeah, that's something which I would discuss. Okay, first of all, thank you, Rodrigo, for answering that question on Latin America. Didn't want to digress from the main topic at all, but then I realized I did. Okay, so sorry about that. But now coming back to Kanishka's question, this is something which I also raised in our previous meeting of the topic. Something which we are calling nowadays called energy stacking. It used to be the energy ladder model previously, that in developed countries it is generally believed that as your income increases, you move from low quality fuel to high quality or in energy efficiency levels. But that is not happening in many developing countries, right? Sasmita and Namrata both raised this issue, and Rodrigo was suggesting as well that we are assuming that somehow if we provide access to energy and sufficient income, people are going to adopt those resources, all those clean energy resources. But is there any kind of role? Is there any role of preferences or taste which exist over there? Because that's what we are seeing, that households are equipped with education, with proper documentation, with access to energy and sufficient income level. Even after that, they are stacking energy resources. So they reuse, firewood, cow dung cakes, kerosene and LPG and even electricity interchangeably. So, not only, so when we talk about the trickle down effect, we need to consider that in the context of policy making, these subsidies play a major role. But simultaneously, we need to propagate these policies through self-help groups, basically women self-help groups. And we should also provide some kind of, incentive in the form of print media, electronic media, where advertisement and the negative externalities attached with the usage of these unclean cooking fuels and energy resources should be properly, should properly come into the knowledge of these households. They should understand that children can be stunted. They should understand that, there are breathing problems which can come into existence, and, the mortality rates can be higher by using these unclean cooking fuels. After that, if we are providing subsidies, that could play a major role. So while we increase the infrastructure, while the political will is very important, we should start considering that we need to change the taste and preferences of households, especially in the rural areas, if we want to pace this process up at the last mile connectivity.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is that it's not just enough to think about it from a supply perspective as well. There is a lot of behavior change that may need to happen. Namrata, Sasmita, Rodrigo,
can I just say one more thing? Because
yes,
in the context of LPG, we have realized in the past before direct subsidies, the amount of corruption which was involved with those red cylinders, we are aware of this, that there was a quota involved, but there was a proper black market which existed for that. And now we are talking about direct subsidies. But the direct subsidies, when they go to the bank account, what is the preference of that household? Do they want to spend on gambling? Do they want to spend on alcohol? Or they want to go for clean cooking fuels? So until and unless we don't create that kind of preferences and change of taste at the ground level, but once again, bargaining power of females is involved over there as well, but we need to keep pushing for that too.
Right. Yeah, Namrata, I see your hand is raised. So would love your thoughts on this, especially if, how much of our effort should be on the demand side in terms of raising the preferences and aspirations of customers. It's also a challenge that just on a more general basis is faced in terms of increasing the demand for electricity and electricity products. So how much of that should be a core part of this agenda?
I agree with Vibhor regarding the move towards changing preferences. It's going to be, of course, and it's going to be a hard journey there because it will require a lot of behavioral interventions. The problem essentially, what we found in our research on why people are, say, not willing to pay for exclusive use of LPG, besides preferences, is that the competition of subsidized LPG, we're not even talking about free LPG, right? The competition of subsidized LPG is with free biomass. So until and unless you create market opportunities for people to do something with that free biomass, they will continue to use that. Of course, add to that the preferences and so on. But I think this is where a lot of there is still a space there in terms of, say, an enterprise, a social enterprise. What do? I mean, do you create like community level methane gas plants instead of people making down cakes? Just tell them to deposit it somewhere else, get money in return for that. So some kind of a value chain will need to be created for the free biomass. And unless and until that doesn't happen, it's something free versus something which you're just getting as at a subsidized rate. So there has to be, I think, from a demand side, there is this preference, and how do you overcome that barrier? Versus there is a real economic question here for households. That's the trade-off between a subsidized good versus a freely available good, because many of them have capital and plants and so on. There is an idea called like complementarity. So once you get people used to, say, one good technology, for instance, say you try to convince people, okay, use electricity. Then from there, they move on to using LPG. From there, they may move on to using proper sanitation and so on. So there is this idea of preference complementarity, which also can be tapped into. It may take time, but it can happen stepwise. So you try to achieve a low-hanging fruit, and then you move on from there. That could be one approach where you go from electricity to basic lighting to LPG to sanitation to tap water and so on. And it's been found that people actually make those decisions. So they start to move up that preference ladder. It takes time, but it's a process that has been observed.
Thanks, Namrata. I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions, but let me just pause for a second. And Sanjana, just wanted to check with you if you've received any questions. And if not, I know we have about 10 minutes remaining on this panel, so I have a couple of questions to kind of start wrapping things up.
We haven't received any questions, so please go ahead.
Okay, great. So I think just to push that point a little bit further, how much of that, behavioral change that Vibhor was talking about, how much of that is purely an affordability issue, which is why, I come back to that question of subsidies or, innovative finance related to, results-based financing, if we want to take a more, let's say, a private sector approach. Because one could say that the whole idea of stacking is fundamentally an affordability and access challenge, right? Like no one you could make the point that if you know, by and large, most people realize that LPG systems are better for you than firewood systems. And really the stacking, even if they do have access, comes down to that fundamental affordability challenge. So I want to put that out there and see if folks on the panel think one way or another. Is it, you know, is it more complex than that? Or is it simply like, look, if we solve the affordability challenge and provide some of these subsidies or different innovative means of financing, which lowers those costs, the transition will actually be smoother? Anybody?
Right. Yeah, I can go ahead.
Yeah.
So, affordability and income levels are always going to determine this. I mean, access and affordability is always going to be the main determinant of, you know, accessing clean cooking fuel or electricity. But I mean, once again, there not only the resources of electricity and LPG, we should also consider the price tags of, you know, cookware, the prices of, you know, pressure cookers and, you know, stoves, and they play a major role as well. But even if we keep them aside, what I meant is like about the preferences is that we eradicated polio. You know, there was a major and there was substantial campaign. I mean, this is the sort of campaign, because when Sasmita was talking about the policy and the trickle down effect, that, you know, the role of gender, my suggestion is that within that whole policy and, you know, the overall idea of propagating the use of energy, there should be a little bit of budget which should be allocated towards this campaign, where people should learn the benefits of clean energy. And in that case, even if the energy stacking is reducing at a specific pace, we can, you know, increase that pace and maybe, you know, achieve the target of cleaner cooking fuel as quickly as possible. So I totally agree with Namrata, what she's suggesting, that it is a process and it's going to take time, but can we just speed it up, you know, with that campaign? And once again, it's a welfare effect. You know, we're going to put some funds in, and what's going to be the welfare? I mean, the health outcomes and the education outcomes, and then there is a multiplier effect as well. So that is why, of course, it's going to take time, but there should be some kind of political will, and some funds should be allocated to start this campaign where people can be educated about the benefits of clean energy.
Thank you, Vibhor. Sasmita, Rodrigo, wanted to make sure I give you both a chance to come in. Rodrigo, go ahead, please.
Yes, absolutely, and it's perfect timing, because after Vibhor comment, in Barefoot College International, we promote and we focus in education. So I think it's one of the most important assets here to consider from our perspective, that how to move on and invest in the education of the communities, education of the women, education in the minorities, and the beneficiaries of these programs and public policies. Because if people understand much better how to the technology is working, how easy to get the access through the clean energies for a better lives, and get the sense of autonomy managing the technology, I think that groups, communities, families, and women are going to be put more pressure to the companies, the public sector, and the multilaterals to implement projects and to connect projects in isolated areas, in rural areas, but because the knowledge and the people educated in connection with that knowledge already are already there to plug in with the opportunity, the subsidies, and the future. But I think that we're working pretty hard to educate women to strengthen the communities, not only to get access for energy, but to generate that sense of the clean energy is the solution, is the way for most of the rural communities in India and many parts of the world. But the factor that women and communities need to be educated and get more connection about how to use the technology is absolutely fundamental. And I think after years of work with Barefoot College, that we are suffering some lack of empathy from governments and private sector, understanding that the education is a key point here.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Sasmita, it looks like you're going to have, in some ways, a little bit of our last word. And I want to go back to the sort of two levers that you spoke about, you know, gender budgeting at the policy level, thinking about, again, targeted solutions that the private sector can provide. Taking it one level deeper, have you seen examples of that work? Like what does it tangibly look like to include, you know, voices of excluded communities? Is it, you know, and what exactly does it look like at, let's say, the planning level? I think it'll be helpful to almost visualize that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I could try based on what I've seen being tried and maybe in some cases work. So for example, I think looking at, we did some work on something called energy safety nets, which is basically thinking of energy access in terms of as like a basic human right. And then there's obviously the part of access that you need to kind of grow, right? So what is that threshold of energy that is absolute bare minimum for any household to be at a sustainable level, the way you have minimum wages, right? So can we think of energy in that way and say, okay, each household needs a certain threshold of energy, which should come either at a subsidized rate or at free rates for the household to achieve a certain bare minimum. Because at the end of the day, if you think about it, it's also a public health issue, right? When you talk about access to clean cooking energy, now there's an added element of public health, there's an added element of climate change. So the pool of money doesn't necessarily have to come only from the energy ministry. There could be these other pots of money we could look at. But thinking of it as a social protection plan, which India is, given the socialist nature of the country, you do have a certain inclination to do that. Your Narega, your other schemes have tried to do the same, right? So thinking of energy in two ways, what is that access level that is the bare minimum that's needed for survival, making that much more affordable, much more accessible, integrated with other social protection plans so that people don't have to really make dual effort to get access to it. For example, in Jharkhand, if you see, they're piloting something where they're integrating access to LPG through the Narega scheme. So in lieu of a few days of Narega's payment, you can access a few cylinders. So kind of thinking of some of these integration as ministries of energy, think of that basic level as making it accessible. And then anything over and above that, you can obviously stagger that subsidy, charge a different rate, kind of look at the market, look at preferences, bring in private sector and so on. So I think that needs to be done. And the federal structure of the country helps in that sense. So there can be states who look at certain mandates and there can be central policies which look at certain mandates. The second thing on the private sector side, I think there's already a lot of investment, both private capital money as well as philanthropic money that's being targeted at this kind of results. So you have blended financing options, which offer that risk capital for social enterprises or big businesses even to pilot some of these strategies and give them the license or the freedom to fail. Pilot a few strategies. You don't have to go all the way. Pilot it in one state and one geography, see if it works, what are the lessons learned, adapt it, and then strengthen it as a model. And we've seen a lot of social enterprises do that, like Dharma Life operates an entire force of women field agents. There's a company called S4S Technologies, whose entire value chain is operated by women micro entrepreneurs, starting from processing of products to the end of like packaging, selling, and then they have B2B clients to do that. And all of this is being funded by legitimate investors who have parked the pool of money to provide that kind of capital for them to pilot and test and grow. Similarly, some of this money goes into enabling finance, because that remains a big challenge for all the marginalized population that we talk about, because it comes down to the lack of assets, lack of collaterals that you, or the lack of a steady income that you can show to access that finance. Again, a lot of government money and philanthropic money and investment money can come in here to say, okay, can we hedge that first 100 loans, the risk that a bank will have to take for the first 100 loans, which incentivizes these financial institutions to then lend to a community which doesn't have a bank account, but is now increasingly like just enrolling into the formal financial system, or women for that matter, who have a savings history, but have not taken a loan yet. So can you bring in these kind of financing options to help do that better? So I would say these are the tools available, and I think it's been tried and tested, but it's just happening in small pockets, because I think the central ministries are not kind of looking at inclusion in the same way as a strategic goal. So like every ministry needs to have that plan. What is my 10-year plan to achieve these targets, and what are those targets going to look like? And then build policies around those. And I think that will start giving you the results once there is a plan, because we've done that across other ministries. MORD and other ministries are doing it. So I think energy ministries definitely can do that. Yeah, I'll pause here.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasmita, and thank you to all of our panelists as well for staying with us and providing such great thoughts and insights on this issue. I think suffice to say that, you know, thinking particularly about the path forward, there is a strong consensus in the group here in terms of both having centralized and decentralized solutions, looking at both the policy side, I think almost first and foremost, because there's a lot there that can then set the stage. But then also to think about, you know, how do you bring in the private sector, especially through incentives and financing? I think that's something that has worked quite well in other aspects of the energy sector that we can maybe think about here. And to Vibhor's point as well, that it's not enough to just look at the supply side, but really think about, you know, what are the next use cases and aspirations from an energy demand perspective, which then also, again, you know, allows you to enable all of the other socioeconomic benefits that electricity and energy access can provide. So thank you so much, Namrata, Rodrigo, Sasmita, and Vibhor. It's been really, really an illuminating 90 minutes, and we really, really appreciate your time and thoughts. Back to you, Sanjana.
Thanks, Kanishka, and thanks to all our panelists. I personally learned a lot out of these sessions. Just wanted to make a quick announcement that I will follow up with all of you once the content is uploaded and the content is harvested. So just hoping that the rich conversation we had today reaches to more people. So I will keep you all posted about that. Thanks once again. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Honor to be here. Thank you very much. Wonderful afternoon in India.
Thank you. Bye.
In Edinburgh.
Thank you.
Thank you.